The Haunting on Mount Solitude. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, just Emma and James, isolated in a remote cabin on the slopes of Mount Solitude. The mountain, covered in a blanket of thick snow, stretched endlessly under the grey sky. Their escape from the noise of everyday life was supposed to offer rest, peace, and tranquility, but the mountain had its own plans. As they made their way up the winding road, the landscape grew bleaker. The trees stood like skeletal giants, their branches weighed down with snow. The higher they climbed, the more the weather turned against them. A blizzard had rolled in, cloaking everything in white, and the road became more treacherous with each passing mile. But they were determined to reach the cabin, an old family retreat that Emma had inherited after her aunt's passing. It was isolated, nestled between towering pines, far away from the bustle of city life. It would be the perfect place to reconnect. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked every bit as remote as they'd hoped. Charming, rustic, and eerily quiet. The wooden structure was weathered, its windows dimly glowing with the flicker of a fire inside. The air was cold, biting, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls outside. They unpacked their bags, and James attempted to reassure Emma, who was beginning to feel the unease settling in her chest. "I thought you said the cabin would be warm," Emma remarked as she pulled her jacket tighter around herself, gazing at the old logs of the cabin's walls. "This place looks isolated. I don't even think there's Wi-Fi here." James chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "That's the whole point, Emma. No distractions. Just us, nature, and a little bit of peace. It's supposed to be like this." Emma smiled half-heartedly. She had hoped for peace, but something about this place felt off. The wind rattled the windows, and the darkness of the surrounding woods seemed to press in from all sides. Still, she forced herself to relax, reminding herself that James was right. It was just a storm. They'd have a fire, some wine, and maybe even reconnect with each other like they once had. But as the evening wore on, the storm outside intensified. The snowstorm battered the cabin, the winds howling like voices in the distance. James stoked the fire in the hearth, but no matter how much wood he added, the warmth seemed to struggle against the cold that seeped into the very bones of the house. The room felt like it was closing in on them. Emma noticed it first, something unsettling in the air. The crackling fire made strange noises, like whispers riding on the wind. Her eyes darted nervously to the window, where shadows shifted just beyond the frost-covered panes, as if something or someone was moving in the darkness outside. "James, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. James paused, looking at her with a hint of confusion. "Hear what?" "I don't know," Emma replied. "It sounds like whispers, faint, almost like someone is calling us." James shrugged it off. "It's probably just the wind. You're imagining things." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling. The sense of being watched grew stronger with every passing moment. As the storm raged outside, she felt an invisible presence in the cabin, something that wasn't just the cold or the wind. The night dragged on, and despite their best efforts to relax, the uneasy feeling gnawed at Emma's nerves. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear those whispers again, louder now, and they didn't sound like wind. They sounded like voices, faint, desperate, and mournful. Around midnight, there was a loud thud outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. Emma froze, heart pounding in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her breath coming in short gasps. James stood, walking to the door, his expression uncertain. "Probably just an animal, or maybe another hiker lost in the storm," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. He grabbed the lantern and opened the door, stepping into the cold, biting air. Emma's breath hitched as she stared into the dark void of the storm. The wind howled louder now, drowning out everything else, but there was something more, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the forest. Suddenly, James shouted, "Emma, get back inside!" His voice cracked with panic, and he quickly slammed the door shut behind him, locking it. He was breathing heavily, his face pale. "James, what is it?" Emma demanded, stepping toward him. He was trembling. "There's something out there. Someone or something is watching us." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had felt it too. The presence, the whispers, the cold. The fire flickered as the wind howled against the cabin, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps at the door. Emma and James stared at each other, their faces filled with dread. No one could have reached the cabin. The storm was too intense, the mountain too remote, yet someone, or something, was outside, and it wasn't just the wind. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. Emma's breath turned to mist, and her heart pounded in her chest. James backed away slowly, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave, now." But the door slammed open on its own, as if some unseen force was pushing against it. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally long. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm of voices. In the doorway stood a figure, shrouded in darkness. A man, or what appeared to be a man, wore tattered clothing, his face obscured by shadows. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark. James screamed, pulling Emma back, but the figure stepped forward with a haunting slowness. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. Emma froze, her blood running cold. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "The mountain never forgets," it whispered. Suddenly the room seemed to implode, the walls creaking and groaning as if the house itself was alive, suffocating them in its grip. The lights flickered and went out, leaving them in total darkness. Emma could hear James's ragged breathing beside her, but when she reached out to grab his hand, he wasn't there. The cabin began to shake violently. The windows shattered from the force of the storm, and the figure lunged at Emma. She screamed, feeling the cold grasp of its hands wrap around her. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind. In the chaos, Emma stumbled back and found herself at the door. She pushed it open and ran into the storm, her feet sinking into the deep snow as she fled down the mountain. Somewhere behind her, she could hear James's scream, lost to the winds. The storm seemed to swallow him whole, and she knew, deep in her gut, that she was the only one left. As Emma stumbled through the snow, her body numb from the cold, she glanced back once. The cabin was gone. It was as if it had never existed at all. Second story, Whispers on the Cliff. It was meant to be the perfect weekend getaway. Rachel and her friends, Mia and Sean, had planned the trip for months. 3 days on the rugged coastline, far away from the pressures of work and the noise of the city. They rented a small, charming cabin perched at the edge of a cliff, offering breathtaking views of the ocean crashing below. The place was remote, isolated, and peaceful, or so they thought. The journey to the cabin was long, the winding road narrowing as they neared the cliffside. The salty air, filled with the scent of the sea, was refreshing after their long drive, and the three friends were excited to disconnect. As they unloaded their bags, the wind whistled through the trees, and the ocean roared below them like a living creature. Rachel stood at the cabin's entrance, looking out over the rocky cliff that jutted into the dark blue waters. "It's perfect," Mia said, taking in the view. She was always the most adventurous of the group, always pushing for something new. Sean, on the other hand, was more cautious. His eyes lingered on the steep edge of the cliff with a worried look. "I don't know about this," Sean muttered, stepping closer to the cabin. "What if it's too dangerous?" Rachel laughed, trying to ease his nerves. "Relax, Sean. We're here to relax, not to worry. Let's get some drinks and enjoy the sunset." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, the three friends sat outside on the porch, sipping their drinks and enjoying the cool evening breeze. The cabin felt cozy, with the fireplace crackling inside and the scent of pine wood filling the air. The first night passed quietly, but by the second night, something felt off. The whispers begin. Rachel was the first to hear them. It started as a faint sound, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as she sat up in bed, the wind outside had died down. The sound was different now. Voices, indistinct but undeniably there. She turned her head toward the window, her heart pounding. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the landscape, but everything outside was still. "Is anyone else hearing this?" Rachel whispered to herself. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, almost like a chorus of voices calling out from the dark. It sounded like they were coming from below, from the very edge of the cliff. The fear in Rachel's chest started to grow as she pushed herself out of bed, her feet cold against the wooden floor. She crept toward the window and peered outside. Nothing. "Maybe I'm just hearing things," she muttered, trying to calm herself. She took a deep breath, but the whispers didn't stop. They became more insistent, more desperate. It was as though someone or something was pleading with her. She turned to Mia, sleeping soundly across the room, unaware of the strange sounds. Rachel lay back down, trying to ignore the noise, but sleep never came. The next morning, Rachel brought up the strange noises over breakfast. Sean and Mia both brushed it off, attributing it to the wind or perhaps the call of seabirds. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers had been too real, too persistent. Later that day, they decided to hike down to the beach below the cliff, taking the narrow, rocky path that twisted along the edge of the cliff. The weather had turned overcast, and the once clear sky was now heavy with clouds. The ocean was turbulent, crashing violently against the rocks below. The wind picked up, howling like an angry spirit. The closer they got to the cliff's edge, the stronger the pull of unease became. Sean, ever cautious, kept his distance from the edge, but Mia seemed unfazed, leading the group toward a small cave near the base of the cliff. Rachel lingered for a moment, looking out over the cliff, her gaze following the waves crashing violently below. That's when she heard it again, the whispers. This time, they were louder than ever, so clear that it almost sounded like someone was standing right behind her. She spun around, but there was no one. "Rachel, come on!" Mia's voice called from the cave, snapping her out of the trance. She blinked rapidly, looking again at the shadows, but they were gone. Her pulse raced as she joined the others inside the cave, trying to push the strange vision from her mind. The cave was cold, the damp air thick with the scent of salt water. They explored for hours, their laughter echoing off the stone walls as they ventured deeper into the darkness. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew heavier, and the sound of the ocean became muffled, replaced by a deep, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Rachel's unease grew with each step. They sounded like voices, agonizing, pleading voices. Some of the words were unintelligible. She kept hearing the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder the further they ventured. But others were clear. "Help me. Come closer." "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Mia replied, seemingly unaffected. Rachel turned to Sean. "You don't hear that. The voices coming from inside the walls." Sean's face hardened, his eyes wide with realization. "I thought I was hearing things, but now that you mention it, I've heard it too." Suddenly the cave shook. A low rumble vibrated through the stone, followed by a loud crack. The ground beneath their feet shifted and rocks began to fall from the ceiling. "We need to get out of here now!" Rachel screamed, pulling Mia toward the entrance. The whispering voices grew louder, now an overwhelming cacophony of screams and cries. The walls of the cave seemed to close in around them, pushing them toward the narrow passageway that led out. But before they could reach the exit, something reached out from the darkness. A cold hand, no, many hands, gripped Rachel's arm, pulling her back. She screamed in terror, struggling to break free, but the hands held firm, dragging her toward the heart of the cave. "Rachel!" Sean cried, pulling her with all his strength. The three friends fought against the unseen force, their terror mounting as the whispers became a deafening roar. Finally, with a final, desperate effort, Rachel wrenched herself free, stumbling toward the exit. Story 3, Frozen Silence. In the heart of the Arctic wastelands, far from civilization, a research team had been stationed at a small, isolated facility for the past 6 months. It wasn't supposed to be a long-term assignment, just a quick data-gathering mission. But after 2 weeks, an unexpected blizzard trapped them in the station, cutting off all communication with the outside world. The storm had grown into an impenetrable force, and with no sign of it letting up anytime soon, the team's spirits had begun to wear thin. The research facility, known only as Arctic Base Alpha, sat like a lone island in the icy expanse. The once bustling rooms were now silent except for the occasional hum of equipment and the tapping of keyboards. A small group of scientists worked tirelessly on their data, while the rest of the crew huddled together, waiting for the storm to pass. Among the team was Dr. Rachel Larson, a brilliant climatologist who had been looking forward to her Arctic assignment for months. The thrill of studying the polar region's shifting climate patterns had been her dream, but now that she was stuck in the coldest place on Earth with no escape, her optimism began to fade. The days had blurred into one another, the isolation overwhelming, and the constant sound of the wind outside felt as though it were wearing down her very soul. Rachel's only companion in the isolation was Dr. Thomas Blake, a geologist with a quiet demeanor and a curiosity that matched her own. They'd often spent hours discussing their findings over meals or in the lab, but recently, even his calm and measured presence couldn't ease the tension building between them. One afternoon, Rachel stepped into the observation room to review their climate readings. The howling wind outside battered the station, a constant reminder of the brutal environment they were trapped in. Rachel sat at the control panel, glancing out the thick frost-covered windows. The sight of the white abyss beyond, with nothing but snow and ice stretching as far as the eye could see, was both beautiful and suffocating. As she scanned through the data, her eyes caught something strange. The weather readings for the past hour were completely off the charts, far colder than any natural readings they'd seen before. The temperature was plummeting in an unnatural way, dipping to levels that were not only unexplainable, but physically impossible in the current climate. "Blake, you need to see this," Rachel called over her intercom. Dr. Blake came into the room, his boots crunching on the snow-like floor, his brow furrowed as he peered at the screen. "What is this?" "This temperature drop. It's off the scale." Rachel shook her head. "It's not natural, Thomas. There's something wrong with the readings. The storm isn't just a storm, it's something else." Blake rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It might be an equipment malfunction. We've had a few glitches before." But Rachel wasn't convinced. She'd spent too many hours in this lab, studying every variable, to believe that this was just a glitch. The readings had been precise until this moment. There was no way to explain the sudden and violent drop in temperature. The first night of whispers. That night, after a long and tense dinner, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, the wind still howling outside. But it wasn't just the storm that unsettled her. It was the eerie silence that had settled over the station. The usual sounds of conversation or activity had faded, leaving only the echo of the wind and the hum of the machines. It started as a faint sound, barely audible, a soft whisper, like someone speaking in the hallway. Rachel froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear more. The whispering continued, drifting closer, like a voice that was too far away to make sense of. She held her breath, trying to figure out what it was, but the whispering grew louder, as though the walls themselves were speaking to her. She jumped out of bed, her feet cold against the floor, and rushed down the corridor. She checked each room one by one, but there was no one there. The station was as empty as it had been all evening. The whispers stopped, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone or something was in the station with her. She tried to calm herself, chalking it up to the isolation and her mind playing tricks on her. After all, it was just her and Blake in the station now, aside from a few technicians who were off duty. But when Rachel passed by the storage room, she saw something that made her heart stop. A faint glow was coming from the cracks of the door, as if someone had been inside, though she knew she'd locked it earlier. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, and they seemed to come from within that very room. With trembling hands, she reached for the door handle, her breath catching in her throat. The moment she opened it, the temperature dropped even further. A blast of icy cold air rushed out, carrying with it an overwhelming sense of dread. Inside the storage room, there was nothing but equipment, empty boxes, unmarked crates, and a strange, shimmering frost that had formed on everything. But Rachel's eyes were drawn to one thing, a large, unmarked metal crate pushed up against the wall. The frost covering it was thicker than anything she'd ever seen, and the whispering, it was coming from within that crate. Rachel knew that whatever was inside, that crate was not something they were supposed to have in the station. She didn't know how it got there, but she could feel its malevolent presence growing stronger with each passing second. The whispers were no longer in the hallway. They were inside her head, filling her thoughts with dread. She rushed to find Dr. Blake, her heart racing. When she found him, he was already aware of the strange events. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling. I heard it too," he said, his voice tight. "The whispers. It's coming from the crate, Rachel. I don't know what it is, but we need to open it. We need to know what's inside." Rachel hesitated, fear gripping her chest, but she nodded. They couldn't ignore it any longer. They had to face whatever was causing the unnatural cold and the whispers. Together, they approached the crate. The moment they touched it, a violent surge of cold shot through the room, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Blake unlocked the crate, his hands shaking with every motion. Finally, the lid creaked open. Inside, there was nothing, just a pile of cold, brittle ice, shaped in the form of a human figure. clear. The frost was too thick for them to make out any details. But Rachel could feel the presence of something ancient, something wrong. The whispers turned to shrieks and the temperature plummeted again. Then it happened. The ice began to move. Rachel screamed and stumbled back, her breath visible in the freezing air. The figure inside the crate was no longer frozen. It had risen, its form slowly shifting and contorting into something unrecognizable. It was a being of frost and shadow, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, chilling light. Its scream echoed through the room, sending a shockwave of cold across the station. Rachel and Blake ran toward the emergency exit, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The figure advanced, its body made of shifting ice and cold air. It reached out with icy claws, and the whispers were deafening now, filling their minds with maddening terror. They had to fight back. Blake grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and hurled it at the creature, hoping the cold would push it back. The creature screeched as the icy spray hit it, but it didn't stop. Instead, it howled and surged toward them faster than they could react. In a moment of sheer desperation, Rachel grabbed the fire alarm and triggered it, filling the room with blaring sound. The creature paused, screeching in agony. The ice around it cracked and shattered, and in that moment, Rachel rushed forward, shoving Blake out of the way as she grabbed the fire extinguisher and blasted it with everything she had. The creature screamed, its form disintegrating into a cloud of freezing mist. With a final, terrifying scream, the creature was gone. The room fell silent once more. The temperature slowly began to rise, but Rachel and Blake were left shaken, their hearts still pounding with the terror they had just witnessed.